Welcome formally to the Red Circle here on October the 1st, 2022. It's a little bit rainy and drizzly. The remnants of Ian are with us today, and it probably makes it a very good day to hear about decapitated people and things like that, as we will do. My name's Alan Reddick. For those who don't know me, welcome, as I say. Lots of things going on today. After Dan Stashower's wonderful talk, we have information about coming attractions, and there are lots of them, including the Red Circle's next live meeting. You'll want to hear about that. Some timely toasts are in store, and a Dana Richards quiz for which you will need paper and pencil. If you want to participate fully, it will be 26 one-word answers. So forewarned is forearmed on that score. It wouldn't be the Red Circle without Peter Blau, who has just celebrated a birthday. Peter, click on and say hello.
Hello. You've almost stolen the first order of business. Welcome to the Red Circle. I think we can dispense with the second order of business, which is everybody take a seat and make sure we've got enough room for everybody. It's very nice to have you all here. And I have to warn you, don't get too close to your monitors, because the most important souvenir that Bev and I brought back from Disney World last week was COVID. And we are both recovering nicely. Thank you. It's nice to be positive. I'm the generation that remembers when people were saying, Dr. Watson, I'm positive. Okay, and for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, you can do a Google search for Dr. Wasserman. Okay, normally I say that Dan Stashower needs no introduction, but there's something new, relatively new in the world of book promotion, and that is they've stolen an idea from trailers for movies and television shows. There are now trailers promoting books. I'm tempted to say that Dan Stashower is someone who needs no introduction, but he's going to get one anyway. Dan has a lot of things to be proud of. One is having been born in Cleveland, as was I. And for those of you who don't know about Cleveland, it's a really distinguished city. It's the only city in the United States whose river has caught on fire more than once. Okay, Dan is a longtime author. He burst upon our Sherlockian world in 1999 with his wonderful biography of Conan Doyle, Teller of Tales. Before that, he had written some other books, including some Harry Houdini pastiches, and there were slight mentions of Sherlock Holmes in them, but I don't think they were really Sherlockian. Dan has gone on to co-edit Conan Doyle, A Life and Letters, which are the letters that Conan Doyle wrote to his mother and to his wife. He co-edited Dangerous Work, which was Conan Doyle's journal of his adventures in the Arctic. And Dan has a lot of fun tantalizing people by refusing to say what his next book is going to be. So you're welcome in the Q&A to ask him what he's going to do next. In the meantime, we're going to hear about American Demon and Elliot Ness. So here's Dan.
Thank you, Peter. When Peter Blau calls and asks you to give a book talk for the Red Circle, you know he's going to want to hear something that is not in the book. He always says, tell me something that I don't know. And as we all know, Peter knows quite a lot. And he's also heard me talk about this book already. So I had to dig deep here. With that in mind, let's kick off with a question. And it's a rhetorical one. You don't have to actually answer. But can you think of the name of Eliot Ness's first publication? The Untouchables, I hear you thinking? You would think so, but no. Here, I'm going to read you a quick excerpt. Private Joe Brown had a rude awakening last weekend. He picked up a girl and took her back to his room in a hotel. The manager called the police, who came right up and arrested the girl. They put her in jail. No one arrested Joe. He was one of our nation's heroic fighting men. Joe was plenty mad. Can any of you guess the title of that book? That's right. It was the opening passage of What About Girls, written by Eliot Ness for the Division of Social Protection Office, the Community of War Services Federal Security Agency. All of which is to say, there are quite a few things about Eliot Ness that we don't talk about when we talk about Eliot Ness. Some of you will remember the old TV series with Robert Stack, which ran from 1959 to 1963. Like me, many of you will have only seen it in reruns. Others will have seen the Kevin Costner movie, which came out in 1987. And you may remember Costner's line as he tosses Frank Nitti off the roof of the Chicago courthouse. He's in the car. I would guess that I'm the only person on this call today who has a pack of Untouchables bubblegum. I really like this. I like Robert Stack's pose. He's saying, buy this gum or I'll shoot these guys. But for most of us, I think it's fair to say what we know about Eliot Ness begins with TV and the movies. Now, this is the part where I'm supposed to say, let me tell you about the real Eliot Ness. But in many ways, he is exactly what you think. He's a man of great integrity and astonishing bravery. He rose to fame during the Prohibition years as the man who got Al Capone, and he's remembered as the leader of the Untouchables, a legendary team of tough guy Prohibition agents. When people think of Eliot Ness, they usually think of a big truck smashing through the doors of an illegal brewery. But he's more than the old school tough guy that we know from the screen. He was also a very forward-thinking reformer. He wanted to pull law enforcement up out of the era of brass knuckles, leather truncheons, and the third degree. Yes, he was astonishingly brave, and his exploits were spectacular. But on screen, particularly in the Robert Stack series, he attacks every problem with violence. And in real life, he didn't care much for violence. And by the time he became the top dog in Cleveland, he rarely even carried a gun. In fact, he once told a friend he didn't need it. An empty holster was enough. But wait, Dan, I hear you say, what's all this about Cleveland? I mean, I know that you and Peter Blau were born there, but we think of Eliot Ness as a Chicago guy. Wrigley Field, deep dish pizza, Eliot Ness. Chicago's where all that drama played out, but that chapter of Ness's career was brief, and it was pretty much all wrapped up by the time he turned 30. So what do you do for a second act? He moves to Cleveland. And why not? The newly elected, reform-minded mayor, whose name was Harold H. Burton, hired Ness to serve as the director of public safety. This was a position that put him in charge of the police department and the fire department and a whole lot more. It's a big, big job, a big promotion. So big, in fact, that a lot of people assumed that Ness would fall flat on his face. In Chicago, he'd been in charge of a handful of guys. Now he's in charge of thousands of city employees in one of America's biggest cities. And what's more, he's the youngest person ever to hold the job. His marching orders are to clean up the police department, which was basically rotting from the inside because of corruption, and also, by the way, to break the stranglehold that the mob had over the city. So, no big deal. Clean up the police force, take down the mob, break for lunch. And the wonder of it all is the degree to which he succeeded. He ushered in real and lasting change, translating the lessons of Capone into real reform. One of his reporter friends said, his timing was terrific. The city seldom had needed a hero so badly. Mayor Harold Burton, seen here with Ness, had a plan to get the city back on its feet. And Ness was crucial. Ness had the knowledge and skills to clamp down on crime and corruption, but he was also good for the city's image. He was trotted out at every opportunity, the public face of the new administration, a symbol of action and change. In the opening weeks of the new administration, Ness was everywhere, addressing the Rotary Club, judging horse shows, flashing his winning smile, as reporters invariably called it, at garden club meetings. The cameras loved him. On more than one occasion, newspapers somehow found occasion to run photos of Ness in tight-fitting gym shorts, showing off his trim physique as he demonstrated his skill at handball and the martial arts. He even told stories of his Capone days to an auditorium filled with what they called howling, yelling, whistling youngsters, all of whom had been awarded badges as members of the local Dick Tracy Detective Club. And then the murders began. Well, actually, they began before Ness took office and they continued on his watch. This was a string of brutal murders that staggered the city. These murders, which came to be grouped under the heading of Kingsbury Run, were chillingly exceptional. Each of the victims had been beheaded. Some, it appeared, while still alive. The remains, in most cases, were painstakingly dismembered and scattered across the city. The horror took many forms. A pair of schoolboys would stumble over a headless torso, or a hacked up section of an arm or a leg would be spotted floating down the Cuyahoga River, or a severed head would appear in a city dump. And each atrocity kicked off a cycle of fear, outrage, calls for action. Thunderous headlines like, "The Mad Butcher Strikes Again," and "Who is this mad torso killer?" 50 years earlier, the entire world had recoiled as a series of horrific crimes unfolded in London's Whitechapel district. Now, it seemed, an unnervingly similar note of terror had been struck in the United States. Cleveland's torso killer, read one national headline, slays in same manner as Jack the Ripper. And there were many parallels, certainly, but also troubling inconsistencies that posed a challenge to investigators. No pattern could be seen in the tally of the dead. It seemed to include both men and women, blacks and whites, straights and gays. The victims, when they could be identified at all, were found to be a mixed bag of indigents, drifters, or prostitutes. People who, as the newspaper said over and over again, people who would not be missed. Some were known to have been living rough in the hobo jungles of Kingsbury Run, which was this dried up riverbed that cut across the city's southeast side. And at the time, it was a gloomy, desolate no man's land, this patchwork of trash heaps and cooking fires, pools of industrial sludge. And this place seemed to serve as the killer's hunting grounds. Here's how one reporter summed it up. He wrote, "Of all the horrible nightmares come to life, the most shuddering is the fiend who decapitates his victims in the dark, dank recesses of Kingsbury Run. That a man of this nature should be permitted to work his crazed vengeance in a city the size of Cleveland should be Cleveland's shame. So we got a killer on the loose, and we've got Eliot Ness in City Hall, the city's top cop. So here we go, right? The Eliot Ness from television would have strapped on his holster and kicked down some doors. The real Eliot Ness is a different guy. It's important to point out that catching killers was not his job. It wasn't what he was hired to do. He wasn't a homicide detective any more than he was a fireman or a crossing guard, although he was in charge of those jobs. He was the director of public safety. He was at the top of the pyramid. Nobody expected the director of public safety to pound the pavement any more than they expected him to rescue cats stranded in trees. But this is Eliot Ness we're talking about. So people did expect action. They expected heroics. Ness had made a point of saying that he would lead from the front lines. And over time, as the pattern of these crimes gathered force, he had to step in. I'm going to do all I can to aid in the investigation, he said. I want to see this psycho caught. Now, I know what you're all thinking. You're thinking, I can't wait to hear more, but first, I just have to have an answer to this one burning question. How did Dan come to write this book? Okay, stop. I'll tell you. Stop with all the clamoring. I grew up in Cleveland, and when I was about 8 or 9, I heard a really, really grisly telling of this story. The story of Kingsbury Run while we were roasting s'mores around a campfire at summer camp. You didn't have to embellish a whole lot to turn this story into the stuff with nightmares. I remember the phrase, "The killer is out there," was repeated over and over again. And at one point, we had to stop and ask the camp counselor to explain what the word decapitated meant. I don't think I slept at all that night. So now it's 50 years later, and lo and behold, I'm a writer who does history and true crime. I'd always wanted to do a story set in my hometown. So it's a full circle moment. In my head, I'm right back at that campfire. You need to bring your own s'mores. But you're also thinking, heavens, that's so terribly interesting, and I can't wait to read this book, but I wonder if Dan stumbled across some surprising personal family connection while doing his research. Why, yes. Yes, I did. I spent a lot of time looking through Ness's papers and scrapbooks, which are housed in the Western Reserve Historical Society Library in Cleveland. As you would expect, there are a lot of familiar names and faces in those newspaper clippings that Ness collected. There's Capone, there are a lot of other gangsters, but also some of the era's shining lights, like FDR, John D. Rockefeller, J. Edgar Hoover. So I'm paging through. Suddenly a face jumps out at me. It's my grandfather, Fred Stashower. I thought, this must be a mistake. I would love to be able to tell you that my grandfather, seen here with the author giving an early interview, was a bootlegger or a bank robber or a murder suspect. But it turns out no such luck. Ness and my grandfather crossed paths at least once a year at a political roast. It was called the Anvil Review. And my grandfather, I came to find out, was a cast member for years and years. This was patterned as like a Comedy Central roast or the Washington Correspondents' Dinner, the Gridiron Club. Ness was a frequent target of what they called their japes and jibes, one of the goats, as they were known. And apparently, Ness took it all in stride. He pasted a caricature of the actors involved into a scrapbook, including my grandfather, who's seen here at the center, along with an audience photo of himself pressing a hand to his forehead, all but doubled over in appreciation of the joke. He may have been untouchable, but apparently he enjoyed a pawky strain of humor now and then. And now, in the most seamless transition imaginable, let's get back to the gruesome beheadings and dismemberments. Now, I should explain, in all seriousness, this is a very twisty, complicated, and often contradictory series of events. And I don't want to do anything here to undermine the many hours of reading pleasure that await you when you read my book. But for our purposes, and for this group in particular, one question leaps instantly to mind. There is a Jack the Ripper style killer on the loose. What would Sherlock Holmes have done? This is not entirely a frivolous question. From boyhood, Eliot Ness had been an avid reader of the Sherlock Holmes stories. It's fair to say that at least some of his passion for modern, scientific, forward-looking crime detection techniques would have been sparked by his love of Sherlock Holmes. You see it in every aspect of Ness's career, even stretching back to the Capone days, when he would occasionally be criticized for his cozy relationship with the press. Ness is an official dear to the hearts of reporters, one journalist said of him. They admire his courage and skill, and they like him personally. It's a pretty safe rule that when reporters respect and admire an official, he's the goods. They see so many phonies that they can smell them out like bird dogs. It's a debatable point, but Ness could justify his openness with the press as a lesson handed down by his mentor, seen here, August Vollmer, known as the father of modern law enforcement. Ness had taken a course with Vollmer on criminology at the University of Chicago. Vollmer, who advised close cooperation with journalists as a means of forging better communications, better community relations, was a very powerful influence on Ness, but it was more than that. Ness knew that his reporter friends could tell him where the bodies were buried, sometimes literally, and that one tip would lead to another tip and another, and then another. Ness learned it from Vollmer, but I think we can look back even further to Sherlock Holmes. The press, Watson, is a most valuable institution, if only you know how to use it. And here's an even more compelling example of the Sherlock Holmes effect on Eliot Ness. At the height of the Capone drama, a group of powerful businessmen had come together to form a group called the Secret Six. They put up private funds to back the anti-Capone effort. In Cleveland, on his first days on the job, Ness sought similar backing from the city's business leaders to assemble a small force of trusted men who would serve as his eyes and ears, a Cleveland version of the Untouchables. These investigators appeared on the city payroll as laborers and garage attendants, but their operating budget was off the books, helping to ferret out corruption within the police department. And then, as the Kingsbury Run drama gathered force, Ness extended this approach with another privately funded independent squad of investigators. This handpicked team made use of the talents of reformed criminals who knew the terrain, probing underworld contacts for information not readily available to the official lawmen. And that's not to say that he neglected the official effort. He devoted extra resources and manpower to the investigation. So, to coin a phrase, he had set the regular forces in motion, but he had also taken his own irregular line of action with a team that could go everywhere, see everything, overhear everyone. Where do you suppose he could have stumbled across such an idea? I'm not claiming that Eliot Ness consciously patterned his career in law enforcement on the teachings of Sherlock Holmes, although isn't it pretty to think so? But like all of us here, he fell in love with the stories when he was young. They became part of his DNA. And also, there were one or two things in the Kingsbury Run drama that would have brought Sherlock Holmes to mind. So, before we throw this open to questions, I will close with another felicitous discovery from Ness's personal scrapbooks, suggesting that it's not so very far to travel from the Grimpen Mire to Kingsbury Run. And I will just say, as an aside to Peter, that I've been sitting on this for 5 years, waiting for just the right moment to spring it on you, and to suggest that in Eliot Ness, the great detective himself might have recognized a foil as quick and supple as his own, an untouchable Watson, an undeniable untouchable. Thanks, everybody. I will be glad to take questions if there are any. Now,
Very good, Dan.
everyone
Thank you.
will goggle in amazement as I try to figure out how to stop my screen share. And there we go.
You have done it. You have found a way to do it. Hey, Dan, that was wonderful. And the cheers I'm looking at, I can't hear them, but I can see them on the screen, are without parallel in the history of Red Circle meetings. So everybody certainly did appreciate everything you did. I did notice that in addition to getting Sherlock Holmes worked into the first few pages of the book, you also got Northwestern University worked in. And I thought that was pretty good. That's
I
pretty
sure
good.
did.
Yep.
Says the one Northwestern alum wildcat to another.
That's right.
And I should explain that there was a groundbreaking forensic crime lab at Northwestern University, and that Ness frequently went back and forth from Chicago to Evanston to bone up on the latest forensic techniques.
And I remember in one episode, I don't know why I remember this, in one episode of The Untouchables, there is a wide shot of Deering Library as one of the locations,
yeah, right.
which is our library. Well, enough of inside baseball. We do have some legitimate questions here. Nancy has actually it's a comment, but it's funny. Nancy Steinecke, why don't you click on and mention that point, because it's very funny.
Hi, this is Nancy here with my friends John and Lee. And yeah, Dan, when you started to talk about decapitate this, decapitate that, of course, I had to go back to my days of listening to Bob and Ray. And I still think it's one of the most hilarious things I ever heard, when the stupid kidnapper is writing his ransom note and he doesn't know how to spell the word decapitate. How many K's are in decapitate? That's the victim.
That's hilarious.
Yes. And I mean, I just think that to remember Bob and Ray is in itself a wonderful thing, because I remember them fondly, of course, the great radio guys. And,
well, WAMU, you got to listen to it.
That's right. Incredible. Ollie Ballou here with the upcutting of the microphone.
Wally Ballou.
No, it wasn't Wally Blue. It was Ollie Ballou, because
Ollie Ballou.
because upcutting a microphone is such an in joke with radio people. It's incredible. Very funny.
Thank you for the mention.
Yeah, this was great. Eric has an interesting comment. Eric Stott, why don't you punch in? There you go.
I haven't much more to say than what I posted. Grandfather was an insurance man all of his days, and it had a concern called I believe it was called the Furriers Protective Alliance. If you Google it, and if I got the name right, he gets quoted occasionally. We have him quoted in a Saturday Evening Post magazine, and he was occasionally his life was threatened by anonymous letters. We used to have his 1920s pistol, which he carried with him. And I don't know how Ness was associated with it, but it's the family story. He may have simply asked him advice.
I'd be interested to know more about that. Anything you can tell me.
That's all I really know. The only bit of trivia I can say is I looked up the address of his office, and it's in the somewhat Art Deco building, which for many years on Fifth Avenue held FAO Schwartz on the ground floor.
Remember the building. Would have been a little out of Ness's jurisdiction in the 20s, but that's not to say he wouldn't have gotten an oar in somehow.
John Sherwood is next. John has a question.
Now I have to find and read it. Hello, Dan. How are you?
I'm just fine.
I'll read it as I wrote it. Are the traits or modus operandis of the Cleveland killer shared with other well-known serial killers, or was he or she unique in any way?
A reporter at the time said that the qualities were so unique at that time that this could be considered the greatest, by which he meant the most notorious mass murderer of all time. Certainly that's a debatable point. I can only tell you that the initial coroner's findings emphasized the fact that there was a certain amount of surgical skill associated with the dismemberments performed on the victims, which led the police to conclude that they were likely looking for someone with a medical background, a doctor of some kind, a surgeon perhaps a butcher, a medical student, someone who would have known, in a phrase that I may botch, but it's in the book, would have known how to navigate the anatomical landmarks as they were approached. So in other words, instead of just hacking at random, this was someone who knew what he was doing when he was cutting up a body. And I realize that's an unpleasant thing to talk about, but it places him in a different category. And
it's reminiscent of the leather apron matter of the Jack the Ripper case and so on.
And Dana Richards, and we'll be talking to Dana again in a minute, but I can ask it real quickly because I don't think you actually said, Dan, was he never caught like Jack the Ripper?
You know, as I said previously, there's a lot of contradiction. There's a lot of if then associated with this puzzle. But I can tell you very clearly that Ness and his team had a suspect that they liked for the crime. They shadowed this suspect for a long time, and the suspect appears to have enjoyed their attention. He played a sort of cat and mouse game with the detectives for a long time. At one point, he stopped and introduced himself to the man tailing him, which, you know, instead of I saw nothing, that is what you may expect to see. The suspect actually turned around and said hi and gave his name. Another time, he shook off a pursuer by jumping off the one streetcar and jumping on another one that was headed in the opposite direction. The young man who was tailing him said that his embarrassment was compounded when he got back to headquarters and found that the suspect had phoned in the meantime and said, "Hey, that guy you've had chasing me around wasn't very good. If he wants to try again, I'm going to be at a department store tomorrow afternoon at 2:00.
That's harsh.
He was toying with them.
Yeah.
Whether this was the guy or not is an open question, but the killings did stop. Whether that was cause and effect is something that people are going to be debating, like the identity of Jack the Ripper, something people are going to be debating as long as these things are talked about.
That kind of leads into a question I had, because I've heard you mention that in researching, you were hoping against hope that you would come up with the undiscovered clue that would lead you to a final solution. Did the fact that you realize that might not happen have any, shall we say, dampening effect on your wanting to go after this thing hammer and tong?
It did not, and I'll tell you why. For my purposes, it was enough that Elliot Ness thought he had his guy. And it's fascinating that Ness, who never passed a photographer or a microphone without giving a quote, without giving some meaty detail, without having his picture taken, doing whatever it was he was doing, Ness brought down a curtain of silence over this investigation that would have brought honor to the Manhattan Project. They observed an absolute blackout silence on what they were doing, which naturally leads me to conclude they obviously did not have any evidence that would stick. But for my purposes, it's enough that Elliot Ness thought he had his man. And I will tell you that for the rest of Ness's life, he received a series of taunting postcards from this guy. And he always walked right up to the line, often walked right up to the line, but never crossed over into anything that would rise to the level of evidence or an admission of guilt. It's a fascinating relationship, and you can only guess the level of frustration Ness was feeling by the time his days as director of public safety came to a close. But it is quite the story.
And especially since the Jack the Ripper parallel is unavoidable, you know, you had that as a predicate, right? Yeah, absolutely. Doug Cron, let's click on and say hi to Dan.
Yeah, hi, Dan.
Hey, Doug.
I was wondering, did Elliot Ness retire from the FBI to take this Cleveland public safety job? Was he driven out of the FBI? What was the deal there? Thanks.
The short answer is Elliot Ness was never in the FBI. Although he's referred to as a G-man, as a prohibition agent, he was a G-man. He was working for the federal government, but he was a prohibition agent. When prohibition was repealed, Ness very naturally wanted to go into the FBI. It would have been a natural career path. J. Edgar Hoover does not seem to have cared for Elliot Ness. And there's been a lot of speculation over the years that it's because Hoover was pretty thin-skinned and he didn't like FBI agents or anyone else who got more press than he did. And as the leader of the Untouchables, Elliot Ness got an awful lot of press. And there was a period at the height of the Capone drama where he was getting as much press as the president of the United States. There are notations in Ness's files at the FBI that basically are showing Hoover losing interest in having Ness on board. So given his druthers before the Cleveland job came along, joining the FBI was absolutely what Ness was focused on. But not only was he not an FBI agent, but there was a columnist in Cleveland who would regularly comment on Ness's doings by referring to him as Elliot never was G-man Ness.
Those are all of the questions we have in chat. I do have a note from Randall Stock that some people have raised their hands to ask a question instead of using chat. And I thought I knew how to drive this car, but I can't find the I can't find the hand raising thing in my list of things to look at. So I'll give you one more shot. If you want to ask a question, put it in chat. Just put the Q in there. You don't have to say what the question is because you all have great questions. So there's no problem with that. And while you're doing that, if you're going to do it, I just want to thank Dan profusely for his tremendous, not just the talk, but the Q&A, which is tremendously enlightening. And thanks so much for being here. Stay with us, by the way, because there is more to come, and I hope Dan will stay too. There is plenty more to come, including toasts, a Dana Richards quiz, and of course, you won't want to miss a Dana Richards quiz. Some one Sherlockian political reference, and a special announcement about our next meeting. So do not go anywhere. Let me check to see if there are more questions. Okay. Yeah, I'm starting to get them here. Dan, I'm not going to let you loose yet. Catherine, would you jump in with the David Grenkiller question? Hello, Catherine. I'll read it because she put the whole question in since she's not clicking on. Dan, are you familiar with David Grann's Killers of the Flower Moon, the Osage Murders, and the Birth of the FBI? Very interested and complicated mystery that had not really been made widely public before the book, and what may be a parallel to your work, and has its share of G-Men hero investigators to boot.
Oh, sure. Wonderful book. Wonderful book. And of course, David Grann is a familiar name in the Sherlockian community. I've enjoyed everything he's written in the New Yorker, but that's a particularly twisty, interesting story. Again, Ness wasn't in the FBI, but he did adopt a lot of FBI techniques trying to phase them into a modernized police department. I see also that there's a question, why did Ness retire to Pennsylvania? He moved to Pennsylvania. He never did actually retire. After he had left the position of director of public safety, and after his wartime work was done, he entered a career in business, pursued a lot of different opportunities. As one friend said, his career became a checkerboard that defies analysis. And it eventually led him to Coudersport, Pennsylvania, where one of the companies he was working for had relocated to reduce its operating expenses. And that is where he died in his 50s of a heart attack.
Dennis Kaiser. Dennis Kaiser.
Yes, I was just recently up in Potter County, and my relatives were telling me about that Coudersport has a big Elliott Ness Festival. There's a museum,
Yep.
and you answered my question why he came there, because I mean, that's God's country. There's just nothing up there. So it just seemed odd that he would wind up in Coudersport.
It's a nice place. I mean, it's a very nice place. It wasn't a huge move. Pennsylvania is a neighboring state to Ohio. They were happy there, and made a lot of friends. And it was while living in Coudersport and working for this company that he made a trip to New York. And in a bar at the Waldorf Astoria, his business partner was catching up with an old friend whose name was Oscar Fraley. And he said to Fraley, this friend said, we've just been shooting the breeze here, but you should get this guy, Elliott, to tell you about his days in Chicago. Well, they talked all night, and Oscar Fraley says to Ness, you should write a book. They wound up writing it together. It was The Untouchables. And today no one would, it's debatable whether anyone would remember the story, if not for that progress from Coudersport to this meeting with Fraley, this chance meeting with Fraley in New York.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. We're going to have to call a halt to this because we have some things we need to do, but everybody stay with us, because right now we are going to go back to friend Peter Blau for coming attractions. Peter.
Dan, I think it's very nice that you once again have a Sherlock Holmes mentioned in your book. Dan has done this in almost every book he's written. Okay, coming attractions. Those of you who've been eagerly awaiting for the sequel to Enola Holmes, Enola Holmes 2 debuts on Netflix on November 4th. And do we have a trailer, Alan?
We do not, but it is on the website. There's a link to the trailer on the website. Link to the trailer on the website. It's a cute trailer too.
And the next day, of course, it'll be on Netflix for quite a while. November 5th, there will be a Saturday with Sherlock Holmes at the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore. Many years ago, this started as a weekend with Sherlock Holmes. And they would do presentations on Saturday and show a movie on Sunday. And they discovered that most of the audience on Sunday consisted of homeless people in Baltimore who'd found a wonderful way to get in and out of the cold. So now it's just a Saturday with Sherlock Holmes. Carla Coop, if you're there, tell us about what's going to happen.
Hi, Peter. Thank you. Yes, this is the 43rd annual Saturday with Sherlock Holmes. I am placing in the chat a link to the event page at the Pratt. We are very, very excited. We have 8 speakers. They're going to be talking about curious places in the from 221B Baker Street to Australia by our own Alan Reddick. And we will have in-person meeting at the Pratt downtown in the Wheeler Auditorium from 10:15 to 1 p.m. or thereabouts. We'll also be able to have live streaming. So if you go to the Pratt website, You can find their YouTube or Facebook channel and watch it live if you can't make it. We're very excited. Please join us either in person or virtually. And we promise a good time. Thanks so much, Peter.
Thank you, Carla. Okay, next up, starting in November 23rd, is a play. Now, there's absolutely nothing Sherlockian about this play, but I really recommend it. It's The Tempest. It's one of William Shakespeare's most magical plays, and the production is co-directed by Aaron Posner, who's very good, and Teller, as in Penn and Teller. Aaron Posner does the acting, directing, and Teller arranges the magic. And they did this sort of thing a few years ago with Macbeth at the Folger, and it was just astounding. And for anybody who likes theater and real magic, I recommend The Tempest. And we'll be at the Roundhouse Theater starting November 23rd. Go see it. More theater, December 6th through January 1st. Ken Ludwig's Baskerville will be at the Everyman Theater in Baltimore. Many of us saw this at Arena Stage some years ago. It's a wonderful play. If you have not seen Baskerville, go see it. Ken Ludwig has done wonders in creating a play that has something for everybody. It's not just a boring recitation of the Hound of the Baskervilles that puts Sherlockians to sleep. There's some interesting things in there. And of course, it's very good for people who don't know all about Sherlock Holmes. Fun play. Go see it. All right, January 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th is the very long weekend of the Sherlockian birthday festivities in New York. There will eventually be an announcement of that at the BSI website, and we'll tell you all about it. If that's not enough for January, on January 11th, Cats comes to the National Theater. Cats is the play based on T.S. Eliot's Old Possum's book of Practical Cats.
Yeah, Book
And
of Practical.
one of the practical cats is Macavity, the mystery cat. And there is Macavity over on the right. This is a good show. Now, when this first played at the National Theater some years ago, Martha Irish arranged for a theater party where we all went to a matinee. And after the matinee, we adjourned to a nearby restaurant. And Macavity came and had a sandwich with us, not in costume. Not going to happen this time. Okay, January 11th, Dan Stashower and Scott Cedar, who've done this long series of really good presentations for the Smithsonian Associates, are going to do Ian Fleming, a creator of James Bond. And they do a very good job. Dan tells stories and Scott reads from whatever it is, and they always come up with new and interesting details. Again, details on this are at our website. January 14th is the Sherlock Holmes Society of London's annual dinner, which may or may not be in the members' dining room in the House of Commons, because it's surrounded by scaffolding now. I first attended a meeting of the annual dinner of the Sherlock Holmes Society in London at the at a hotel. The next one was at Lincoln's Inn, which is very, very Tudor. The next one was at the House of Commons. And I said to him, you know, you're really going to have to get grander than this and go to a palace. And Jonathan McCaffrey looked at me and said, well, he said, we're negotiating with Lambeth Palace, which is the home of the Archbishop of Canterbury. So it may be even grander on January 14th. And if you want this to do more of the Brits, from March 11th to April 2nd, the Sherlock Holmes Society of London is going to have one of their wonderful excursions, a 3-week trip to India, pursuing the jewel in the canon. Alan assures me that that's an authentic photograph of the Taj Mahal on the right We know it's authentic because he took it.
Along with plenty more pictures of the great red Forded Agra not far away.
And then finally, April 29th through May 21st in Cleveland, Ken Ludwig's next play will have its premiere. He is doing for Moriarty what he did for Sherlock Holmes with Baskerville. And it ought to be really something. I'm not aware that it's scheduled for production here in Washington, so you can either be patient or go visit Cleveland. Cleveland Playhouse is a downtown, very nice theater. I'd recommend it to anybody, even if I wasn't born in Cleveland. Okay, now while we're on the subject of Ken Ludwig, I'm happy to announce our next meeting is going to be live at Alfio's. We're back, and our guest speaker will be Ashley Polasek, who's executive director of Ken Ludwig. She just makes sure that he does the right thing. Ashley is a great speaker. She co-edited the book about Sherlock Holmes behind the canonical screen. The collection of papers was presented at the BSS conference at UCLA. She's one of the Baker Street Babes and a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. I'm happy to report that Alfio's has not raised its prices, so our luncheon on Saturday will cost, again, $35, which is a lot less than our June meeting with the sub-librarians. I look forward to seeing you all there. Watch for the website the next few days for details. Now, we've lost a dear friend of many of us, and that's Nick Utakin, who died in September after a long illness. Nick was a treasure. He joined the Sherlock Holmes Society of London at the age of 14. 10 years later, he became the editor of the Sherlock Holmes Journal and had a 30-year run as editor of the SHJ. When he retired, he was made an honorary member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. Nick's also a member of the Baker Street Irregulars as the Ancient British Barrow, and he's a member of the Red Circle because he was one of our speakers, thanks to Zoom, in 2020. Nick was a multi-talented man. He worked for many years in broadcasting. He had a wonderful broadcasting voice. He was great in production. He was a wine connoisseur. He was an Oxford man. And by that, I mean, he really was a patriot. There's a great argument in England as to whether Sherlock Holmes went to Cambridge or to Oxford. And Nick has written a book about what he calls the controversity. And he believes, of course, that Holmes was an Oxford man. He'll speak to you if you think Holmes went to Cambridge, but he will have a lot to say about Oxford. We will miss him. And I'd like to offer a toast to Nick, who deserves it. Okay, time for toasts. Now, our first toast is by Bonnie McBird, who has written her 5th Sherlock Holmes pastiche. What Child Is This? I've read it, I reviewed it, I enjoyed it. It's got good artwork. It's a great Christmas story, but you don't have to wait for Christmas to read it. So, Bonnie, tell us about coffee in the canon.
Cheers. We think of the English as a tea drinking nation, but unlike the late Queen Elizabeth, who took tea at breakfast, she took Earl Grey, no sugar, no milk. Holmes and Watson woke up to coffee. There are 32 mentions of coffee in the canon, of which only one refers to other than their favorite hot beverage. Coffee came to England in 1652 in a stall near what became Leadenhall Market, run by a Greek who's said to have sold 600 dishes of coffee every day. But not everybody loved coffee at first. It was said by its detractors to taste of ink, soot, mud, damp, and most commonly, excrement. As coffee houses grew in popularity, they often took on distinct characters. One was also a barber shop. Another was lined with taxidermy. It was a gathering place for scientists. Some evolved into exclusive membership-only establishments, often involving gambling. In a certain Lloyd's coffee house, the talk was of shipping, and many deals were struck, and this morphed into Lloyd's of London. Coffee became an important part of political discourse, and so therefore it was considered a part of Enlightenment culture. Of course, there were detractors. Early on, a women's group formed declaring it an evil which turned men into lazy versions of themselves. Others swore it was addictive, soporific, overly stimulating, yes, these conflict, and made people prone to gambling. Women were forbidden to drink coffee at first, although they were enlisted to serve it. All of that changed over time, and it became a mainstream drink in the early 1800s. It peaked during Georgian times, and at the era of Victoria's marriage to Albert, more coffee was being imported into England than tea. By Holmes's time, it settled into more of a commonplace drink, and it was the choice of many at breakfast. Now, I prepared this rather long citing of coffee in every place that it appeared, but that would make this toast way too long, so I'm just going to pick out a few highlights. The Study in Scarlet, a grumpy pre-coffee Watson recounts. I rose somewhat earlier than usual and found that Sherlock Holmes had not yet finished his breakfast. The landlady had become so accustomed to my late habits that my place had not been laid, nor my coffee prepared. With the unreasonable petulance of mankind, I rang the bell and gave a curt intimation that I was ready. So they really wanted their coffee. So Watson narrates in A Sign of Four, a bath at Baker Street and a complete change freshened me up wonderfully. When I came down to our room, I found the breakfast laid and Holmes pouring out the coffee. And then later on, Holmes grins at him over the coffee cup. In one of my favorite moments in Red-Headed League, Holmes, of course, invites Watson to a sandwich and a cup of coffee, and then off to Violin Land. In a case of Identity, this is the only use of coffee as not a drink. Watson describes a woman, her dress was brown, rather darker than coffee color. So anyway, there's a strange use of coffee in the Five Orange Pips, because Holmes says, just ring the bell and the maid will bring up your coffee. But what maid was that? She's never mentioned anywhere else in the canon. Maybe Mrs. Hudson employed a helper from time to time. That's the only time we hear that. Anyway, so they're always refreshing other people and themselves with this. And of course, it was a big plot point in the Naval Treaty when Percy Phelps recounted, I was feeling drowsy and stupid, partly from my dinner and also from the effect of a long day's work. A cup of coffee would clear my brain. A commissioner remains all night in a little lodge at the foot of the stairs. It is the habit of making coffee at his spirit lamp for any of the officials who may be working overtime. I rang the bell, therefore, to summon him. Of course, this coffee never came, and that was one of the big plot points in this story. Later on, of course, the denouement of this story is over breakfast, and it's a very theatrical reveal. And Mrs. Hudson enters with tea and coffee and 3 covered dishes, and of course, the Naval Treaty is under one of them. And a little later, Watson says, Sherlock Holmes swallowed a cup of coffee and turned his attention to the ham and eggs. Anyway, so they love their coffee. There's an endless more more examples of this. My second favorite coffee reference is in Hound of the Baskervilles, and of course you'll all remember this one. It's not really about the coffee. He says Watson is doing something, and Holmes deduces or just says what it is that he's doing, but his back is to Watson, and he says Holmes was sitting with his back to me, and I'd given him no sign of my occupation. How did you know what I was doing? I believe you have eyes in the back of your head. I have at least a well-polished silver-plated coffee pot in front of me, said he. He also says that he during the Hound of the Baskervilles adventure, he claims to have traveled to Devonshire in spirit, that is to complete his investigations. And he says, my body has remained in this armchair and has, I regret to observe, consumed in my absence 2 large pots of coffee and an incredible amount of tobacco. So he's quite polluted himself by that. In the cardboard box, the ears that came in wrapped in a brown paper with a distinct smell of coffee. And in the Bruce Partington plans, Holmes invites Watson to join him in a coffee and curacao. But of course, I think the most characteristic use of coffee is this. In the illustrious clients, Holmes says to Watson, "When you've finished your coffee, you best come home with me. Here's to coffee in the cannon."
Thank you, Bonnie. I should note that when I arrived in England to work there as a geologist in the 1960s, I was startled to discover that this nation of tea drinkers actually was first a nation of coffee drinkers. And I asked someone, I mean, what happened? Why did they switch? And my fellow geologist said, it's because the British don't know how to make a good cup of coffee. Actually, the reason was that tea became much cheaper than coffee. But anyway, it's widespread now, and Starbucks is everywhere, so they have good coffee in England now. Okay, thank you, Bonnie. Our next toast is by Jean Marie Zubia, who went to Toronto for their 50th anniversary meeting. Jean Marie, our next toast, please.
Thank you. I'm glad Bonnie toasted to coffee because I am in Washington State, so it is breakfast time for me and coffee time. So last week, I attended Toronto Bootmakers 221B Jubilee, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Toronto Bootmakers and the collections by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, or ACD. The weekend was a celebration of the works by ACD, most especially the author's incarnation of our beloved master detective Sherlock Holmes. Over a century of our multidimensional tributes to his persona keep him alive as any human friend would be. It was very evident from this Jubilee's festivities that Sherlock Holmes brings us comfort and inspires a profusion of creative expressions. We were entertained by riveting poetry recitations, fabulous song and dance numbers, presenters from Sherlockian societies across the globe that included India and Japan. We had a live radio show, a violinist at the banquet, as well as an exquisite toast to our recently departed Her Majesty the Queen. Director, screenwriter Nicholas Meyer enthralled us by describing his approach to writing. Every actor, scholar, artist, and musician, all the readers and writers who personified Sherlock Holmes and his adventures at this Bootmakers event grandly contributed to that tradition that mixes scholarship and whimsy beginning in 1972. This is why I invite you all to raise a glass or cup with me in a toast to congratulate the Toronto Bootmakers and the ACD Collection of Canada for a tremendously scintillating 50 years and sincerest wishes that they continue in perpetuity. Hear, hear.
Thank you, Jean Marie.
Welcome.
I'm told that Monica Schmidt was also north of the border. Monica, what did you enjoy in Toronto?
Oh boy, how do I follow up such an amazing toast by Jean Marie? So, thank you, Jean Marie.
Thank you, Monica.
But hey, after you giving the highlights, I will just say most of my talking points have been touched on. Okay, so the good news about Jubilee at 221B, it was a genuinely lovely conference up north in Toronto. Although from where I sit in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, it's not quite that much further north. So we were treated on Tuesday, the 22nd. Peggy Perdue took a gathering of us on a walk through some of the Sherlockian and cultural highlights of Toronto. And, one of the things, or it began at the Sherlock Holmes Walk, which is right behind the library. And I believe Alan may have a slide, looking at the street art that is about to be put on that, or in that space. There's a lot of graffiti on the wall behind the, we'll just say there's a lot of graffiti on the wall behind the library. And so they have commissioned a group of artists to be able to kind of create almost like a patchwork of street art. And this just happens to be one of them, which utilizes not only Sherlock Holmes imagery, as well as a fabulous quote, but also the Sherlock Holmes tartan. So I thought it was quite lovely. Highlights of the walking tour, of course, included, the birthplace of Raymond Massey, who of course played Sherlock Holmes in film in the 1930s, as well as a little Toronto bookshop, now pizza place, that happened to be the quote unquote birthplace of Vincent Sterrett, who happens to be pretty darn important to our hobby. On Friday, the conference opened up with a lovely group of speakers. There were a number of highlights. Ross Davies took us through advertising and the dancing men. Julie McHurst took us through a case of identity. Most interestingly, to me, Mark Alberstadt referenced Conan Doyle's Sports and National Identity and gave a quote from Arthur Conan Doyle that made me chuckle and a number of people chuckle. He says, or Conan Doyle said, that cricket is a manly sport. It is the manliest sport ever. A number of people turned around and looked at me, and not really recognizing that a female cricketer is among them. So apparently I'm more manly than everybody else in the room, according to Arthur Conan Doyle. I'll take it. There was also a wonderful presentation by Nick Martorelli looking at Sherlock Holmes in science fiction, and wonderful songs performed by Karen Gold and Jim Ballinger. The Cameron Hoyle lecture by Douglas Kerr was about editing Conan Doyle. It was an absolutely fascinating and riveting interview or presentation. Day two of the conference was Saturday, and it opened up with Michigan's own Rich Kirshunas talking about Sherlock Holmes and the law. There was a lovely presentation of from Ashley Polasek looking at the other silent version of The Hound of the Baskervilles. Not the 1939 version, or sorry, not silent, but not the 1939 version that we are familiar with, but another one as well. Charles Prepelec looked at the concept of Arthur Conan Doyle, Sherlock Holmes, and Gothic horror. And there was a fantastic presentation by, of course, screenwriter and director Nicholas Meyer. Interesting tidbit from his talk, which was the keynote speech, was that he was approached to direct the movie Young Sherlock Holmes. And after reading the script, decided to pass on it, because even though he is a master of pastiche, he decided that the script took it a few steps too far. It's not canonical, he says, that Holmes and Watson met as teenagers in school. And therefore, because it was not canonical enough, he just said, no, thank you. And Sunday brought the conference to a close. There was a wonderful talk by Mitch about Sherlock Holmes in Japan, and a radio play written by David Markham and performed by R.H. Thompson, the legendary Canadian actor R.H. Thompson, who was amazing in the movie The Quarrel from 1991. If you guys have not seen, please seek it out. His performance is stellar. But R.H. Thompson played Sherlock Holmes, and a lot of fun was had by all. Now, one highlight that you wouldn't find in a program book was that Saturday night after Nick's lecture, a number of Sherlockians were led astray. There was a small excursion of us that went to a drag show at one of the gay bars in Toronto, led by Toronto bootmaker Kathy Burns, who happens to also perform as Liza Minnelli at some of these clubs, as well as Wendy Heyman-Marsaw. So it was, I think the idea of taking the Sherlockians to the drag show would be a kind of a new entry in Sherlockian lore. So a lot of fun was had up north.
Thank you, Monica. I'm reminded that one of Mick Utakin's enthusiasms was cricket. He put on his whites to participate with the Sherlock Holmes Society of London in their contests with the Woodhouse Society. But one of his great accomplishments was leading the campaign to restore and recondition Arthur Conan Doyle's cricket bat, which was brought from the Lausanne in Switzerland, and is now in the Cricket Museum at Lord's.
Oh my gosh.
Thanks to Nick and many others. Okay, if anybody, not today, but if anybody would like to do an irregular toast about something at a future meeting, please get in touch with me. I like the idea of regular toasts. So it's quiz time. Alan, you
It
have a
is quiz
for us.
time. It is quiz time. We are back with quizzes. And when at the Red Circle, when we say it's quiz time, we mean it's Dana Richards' time. So Dana, are you there? Please click on and say hi.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
Okay.
You have a very special quiz based on Mr. Stashower's presentation, I understand.
I do. So it wasn't clear how to proceed until I realized that having Ness on your tail was a entry point for a quiz. So we're going to have Ness on your tail. So we're going to have some quotes for you, and there will be a missing word that ends with Ness. And turns out there's quite a few instances that are probably recognizable to a great many of you. So we'll just do these one at a time, and the answer will be presented soon thereafter. So you have about 15, 20 seconds to commit, and then we'll move on to the next one.
Yeah, we won't be going back to review them. So you'll either get it or you won't in the first 20
Okay,
seconds or so.
so either just record that you got it right or write your answer down.
But there will be 26 possible points.
25 questions with the last one having 2 answers.
All right. Shall we proceed?
Let's go. Both Holmes and I had a blank for the Turkish bath.
From the
And of course,
illustrious
the
one.
stories are indicated in every instance. Sometimes the story is a additional hint.
All right, we'll give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we'll give you the answer.
Yeah, they had a weakness for the Turkish bath.
If you said weakness, you score a point.
There you go.
If not, try on number 2. Try for number 2.
And in practice again, I observe, you did not tell me that you intended to go into blank.
Lots of possible answers here. Let's see if you got the right one in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Harness. So he was back in his doctor's practice, and so he was back into harness. It was evident to all that I was in for a long blank. So Joseph was bundled out of his cheery bedroom, ...
From the Naval Treaty.
Naval Treaty, again, that would be a clue. In fact, this figures at the central part of the story.
I think many people may have gotten this one. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And illness.
Score a point if you said illness.
There's a well-known agency for blanks in the West End called Westaways on Copper Beaches. There are many possible quotes that for this word, but I think Westaways was an additional clue for some people.
And the answer is governesses for a point.
It is only a few miles away, and we imagined that in some sudden attack of blank, he had gone back to his father. And priory school is a helpful clue here.
Yes, it is actually. Good point. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Homesickness.
Next.
A sandwich and a cup of coffee, and then off to violin land, where all is blank and delicacy and harmony, and there are no red-headed clients to vex us with their conundrums.
And the answer is
Sweetness. I don't see you in the blank box. Quite another shape box, my good Holmes, I assure you.
I think a lot of people will get this one. I really do. And it is
The witness box. The atmosphere of the room was of a horrible and depressing blank. The servant who had first entered had thrown up the window. Devil's foot, again, that's probably a helpful clue.
answer.
Stuffiness. Only in color. His face was, how shall I describe it? It was of a fish belly blank. And again, blanched soldier is an additional clue.
And it is
Whiteness. I could never bring you to realize the importance of sleeves, the blank of thumbnails, or the great issues that may hang from a bootlace.
Five, four, three, two, one. Here we go.
Suggestiveness. I thought of the assistant's blank for photography and his trick of vanishing into the cellar.
From the Red-Headed League, the answer is
Fondness. He had contrived with that cat-like love of personal blank, which was one of his characteristics, that his chin should be as smooth and his linen as perfect as if he were in Baker Street.
and we have
Cleanliness. His plump face was twitching with his blank, and his fingers could not keep still.
good clue there. Good clue to the correct answer, which is
Nervousness. Strange, said I, how terms of what another man I should call blank alternate with your fits of splendid energy and vigor.
context is everything. The answer is
Laziness. Alternating with fits of that. Holmes is a little too scientific for my taste. It approaches to blank. It's a hyphenated word. Little too scientific for my taste. It approaches to blank.
and the answer.
Cold-bloodedness. I'm sure somebody's out there has got all of these so far. He used to make merry over the blank of women, but I have not heard him do so of late.
There's a lovely reading of that line in the Jeremy Brett series. I just always hear it when I see that line.
Cleverness. For a moment, I saw something in his eyes. It was nearer to blank than I had ever seen. The next instant, he was his masterful, practical self once more.
An unusual
It is a.
unusual character.
There's only two instances in the whole canon of this
Yeah.
sort of emotion.
Yeah, the other one's in Garadebs, I guess, right? Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Tenderness. Why do you not write them yourself? I said with some blank.
It's not sweetness.
That's Watson talking to Holmes.
Yes, of course. And it's not sweetness. It is.
It's definitely not bitterness.
All right.
I say that these monstrous laws of yours will bring a curse upon the land. God will not let such blank endure. I actually wrote a whole pamphlet about this quote.
Did you? Yeah.
Yes.
The answer is
Wickedness. Well, would you please, sir, march upstairs where we can get a cab to carry your blank to the police station?
it would be helpful to know that he had royal blood,
It did indeed.
or thought he did anyway.
Well, Your Highness. As to his dress, it was careful to the verge of blank, with a high collar, black frock coat, white waistcoat or waistcoat, yellow gloves, patent leather shoes, and light colored gaiters.
I thought it was fussiness, but it's not, is it?
It's not fussiness,
It's not fussiness. It's
foppishness. He was, as the inspector had said, extremely dirty, but the grime which covered his face could not conceal its repulsive blank. This is one where you could probably guess it if you didn't know the quote.
Let's see if they did.
Ugliness. It is a mistake to confound blank with mystery. The most commonplace crime is often the most mysterious because it presents no new or special features from which deductions may be drawn.
So confused. Something with mystery. Let's see. What could it be? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Ah,
The opposite of the commonplace, strangeness.
all right.
Now this one has two words. It's the same word twice. I will tell you, said Holmes, and the reason why I tell you is that I hope blank may beget blank.
So it's only 1 point because it's the same word in both instances. And that word is?
Frankness.
On the other hand,
the next one has two answers which are different. Obviously from the empty house. The old shikari's nerves have not lost their blank, nor his eyes their blank, said he with a laugh as he inspected the shattered forehead of his bust.
why, one might almost think it was the 6 Napoleons, but it's not. It's the other
No.
bust.
It's the other bust.
It's the other bust. And 25 and 26, two answers. You get 2 points if you get them both, one for each.
Steadiness of his nerves and the keenness of his eyes.
There you go. And that is the quiz. What I propose we do is I'm gonna pull up the chat. Anybody who got 20 or more, type your name into, or not your name, the number you got right into chat for everyone, and we'll see who the winners are today.
I think we should disqualify Dan Stashower if he claims to have won anything.
Yeah, that's true.
All right. Yeah, I don't know if he knew this quiz was coming, but he could have studied.
Let's try 15 to 20. Oh, here we go.
17, that's what we're looking for.
That's what we're looking for. As I said 15 to 20, we got some business here. Let's see.
Yeah, I knew Ann would come through.
Oh, Ann always comes through. Yeah. MK, okay, that's 3. All right. Anybody else between 15 and 20? Speak now or hold your peace. All right, let's try one more. Let's try 10 to 14.
All right. Our Czech friend.
Marketa from the Czech Republic. Marketa has 11.
I see.
Bruce. Okay. So, Peter, what we seem to have here is several 11s, a 13, a 15, a 17, which is a good batch of prizes. It'll all come out in the report, and Peter's going to tell us about the prizes he's got in store. Peter?
Thank you, Alan. As usual, our prizes have no particular value because we don't want to disappoint the people who didn't win the quiz. They will be old issues of the Baker Street Journal, old enough that you might not even been born when they were published, or a subscriber. And come to the meeting at Alfio's in December and pick up your prize. If you're too distant, you can't come to the meeting, let me know and we'll work something out.
And congratulations to everybody for participating and for those who were the winners. That's great. Peter, you have some final things here.
Yes, one of the specialties of the Red Circle of Washington is to keep an eye on Sherlockian politics and political Sherlockians. And it was fascinating to me that recently, well, the most famous Sherlockian phrase now that everybody has heard, and some people won't say in mixed company, is no Sherlock. And I found out how they do this in Lake Wobegon, because there was a video clip of Scott Jensen, who is running for governor of Minnesota on the Republican ticket, as you will soon see. And he came up with the Minnesota version of that famous phrase. Alan?
And this is a letter from Tim Walz to many of his supporters. And evidently, Tim Walz and his team has selected me to be the spokesperson for the other side of the story. Here's what he says. He said, Scott Jensen, the emerging GOP frontrunner, has picked a lieutenant governor running mate, former NFL football player Matt Burke. It's easy to see why Jensen picked Burke. Burke supports a ban on abortions in Minnesota. No kidding, Sherlock. You're darn right we do. And we're going to. And we're going to get something done when we're governor. We're going to ban abortions.
Okay, no kidding, Sherlock. Finally, we still have Sherlockian pins. I don't know, is Tom Fars at our meeting, Alan?
I don't think he's here today.
Okay, but he'll still be happy to do pins. There's something on the website. You have a slide?
I do.
Yes.
And yes, Tom's email is right there. You can get a pin by simply emailing him and he'll tell you where to send the money.
All right. Thank you. Next, the Red Circle's mailing list. We have at the moment 204 people on our mailing list, but there's room for lots more because Google does not have a cap on it. If you would like to be on the mailing list for occasional announcements from the Red Circle, please let me know. If you know anybody who'd like to be on our mailing list, please let me know. Finally, hope to see you all at our in-person meeting on Saturday, December 17th for lunch at Alfio's, where they will have the homemade spumoni and other fun and games. So thank you very much for coming. See you again.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for being here and appreciate all your kind attention. We'll see you at the next Red Circle.